Hey guys, it's Selwen here. To finish off with the rogue, let's talk about Subtlety. The sub-rogue is a rogue spec that is all about using stealth to your advantage, or rather shadow dance, in combination with your other abilities to put out all them finishers in the biggest numbers possible. Out of all the specs, sub is the one with the highest amount of mobility due to charges on shadow step and abilities like Shadowstrike that teleports you behind the target. As for the rest of your toolkit is the same as the other specs, besides the fact that you do have a shadow theme around some of your abilities. But needless to say, defensives and survivability is amazing on the rogue, having a tool to deal with any sort of damage coming your way. But before all of that, let's talk about talents. On the tier 1 we have Weapon Master and Find Weakness. Numbers wise they are pretty even. A Weapons Master is the easiest and it's a simple passive, adding a 15% chance to your backstab and Shadowstrike to strike an additional time, while Find Weakness, Shadowstrike and Cheap Shot applies a debuff allowing you to bypass 40% of the target's armor, essentially providing more damage. Now, like I said, a single target wise is practically the same, with Find Weakness being the more interactive talent that you can do some stuff with, like stacking with your other abilities. In AoE, you can find Weapon Master easier to use due to target switching to keep up that debuff, but since AoE in sub is about sticking to one target, it won't do that much of a difference. And in fact, Find Weakness will be better when playing correctly. As for Gloomblade is the weakest, but like Weapon Master is easier to use than Find Weakness. In tier 2 we have talents which are focused around stealth or shadow dance, such as Shadow Focus. Abilities now cost 20% less energy inside stealth or shadow dance. This tends to be the go-to for everything, smoothing out your rotation a bit and allowing you to use more abilities during said shadow dance. As for the others are sadly weaker, although affecting rotation in some pretty interesting ways, such as Subterfuge, acting as you still in stealth 3 seconds after coming off it, and adds 1 more second to Shadow Dance. In short, allowing you to use Shadow Strikes more frequently, but also you're gonna get a bit energy starved, so not as strong. Night Stalker in turn adds some extra mobility and more damage while in Shadow Dance or in stealth, which is great, but like Subterfuge you can encounter the same issue. However, both of these are better for just burst damage, so in AoE or cleave situations like fights like Zul, where you're gonna do so many finishing moves, energy isn't as a big deal since you get a lot of it back due to relentless strikes, so might as well take this damage increase. The same can be applied for dungeons. At tier 3, both Deeper Stratagem and Marked for Death will work. A Deeper Stratagem will add an extra combo point and 5% more damage on finishing moves, overall more damage on those spenders, which is what sub is all about. Marked for Death has a similar use, filling all points on demand and refreshing the CD if the target dies within 1 minute. Since it's an active ability, it will change a bit of your rotation, while Deeper Stratagem does it to a much smaller degree. Both work for single target, but in cleave/AoE situations, especially sustained ones, a Deeper Stratagem will be better just due to the amount of finishing moves you put out, overshadowing Marked for Death. As for Vigor is currently weaker, but like Shadow Focus is improving energy, giving 50 more and increasing its regeneration. Easier to play with, especially for beginners as you get more energy to go around, but once again numbers wise weaker than the other two. On tier 4 is entirely optional, we get Cheat Death, which is amazing, entirely passive to prevent your death, excellent for soak mechanics or to forgive mistakes. As for Elusiveness, equally great, as it allows your feints to not only reduce AoE damage, but reduces all damage taken by 30%. More defensives is always great, but you're gonna have the downside of having to click it. And Soothing Darkness, another passive, a self-heal while in stealth or when Shadow Dance is active, you're gonna heal 3% of your HP every second. Great for healing intensive fights, helping out your fellow healers, but amazing for open world as well. Following tier is once again optional. Night Terrors adds some extra utility to Shuriken Storm, reducing movement speed by 30%. It's not the best movement reduction, but still something to slow with in dungeons. Prey of the Week is the most unique and useful. Cheap Shot and Kidney Shot, or even Sap, adds a debuff to the target, increasing all damage taken by 10%, even working for your teammates, so great for dungeons or ad fights. And Shot in the dark, least useful by just making Ship Shot free to use once after entering Stealth or Shadow Dance. And on the tier 6, like the previous tiers, both Dark Shadow and Enveloping Shadows will work, although they will offer damage benefits in different ways. Enveloping Shadows will add an extra charge to your Shadow Dance, plus increases its cooldown reduction buff, more on that in a bit. This will work for more Shadow Strikes, basically, which translates to more combo points and finishers. I also find this easier to use for beginners, especially when you combine Master of Shadows here in the last tier, and just because you can use Shadow Dance more often, it's just easier to build combo points. It will change gameplay a little bit though. I'll explain all of that later on. Dark Shadow in turn is increasing your overall damage by 25% during Shadow Dance, which, needless to say, offers far more burst to use those same Shadow Strikes and finishers. So amazing as well. For AoE, I do prefer this one over Enveloping Shadows, like dungeons, because Shadow Dance charges in AoE isn't as a big deal because you have so many finishing moves to perform, you're gonna get them rather fast, so might as well just get more damage through Dark Shadow. Similar thinking to Shadow Focus and Night Stalker, or even Deeper Stratagem and Marked for Death. Alacrity is in turn the weakest. It's decent, but the haste provided doesn't really justify losing either Dark Shadow or Enveloping Shadows, but it does have its niche when cleaving due to the sheer amount of set finishing moves you can perform. And on the last tier, we have Master of Shadows. You now gain 25 energy over 3 seconds when you enter Stealth or activate Shadow Dance. Like Shadow Focus back there, this will smooth out your rotation, enabling you to easily put out your necessary Shadow Strikes and finishers, so perfect for single target fights. As for the others, have their specific uses or niches, like Secret Technique, much like the older or now PvP talents Death from Above, is a powerful finishing move that damages all targets in front of you, plus its cooldown gets reduced by every combo point spent. This is only really usable currently in AoE situations, for just more burst AoE damage, especially when you also take in consideration all the finishing moves you're gonna perform in AoE, reducing its cooldown much faster. It's also usable in single target and might overtake Master of Shadows in time, especially when energy becomes less of an issue with better gear, haste, and etc. The same thing happened during Legion. You first started with Master of Shadows but progressively changed to Death from Above. If you play with this, you might want to consider taking Dark Shadows as well, if you're usually someone that sticks to Enveloping Shadows for that 25% more damage. As for Shuriken, Tornado has its niche, but is a pretty interesting ability. It's a cooldown where for every second out of 4 seconds, you send out a Shuriken Storm. What this will do is remove a global cooldown out of your AoE rotation in order to do more finishers. So when you take in mind a fight like Zul, where you constantly or almost constantly cleaving, this will be great. Dungeons though won't function as nicely, but workable, but for that I just recommend a Secret Technique or even Master of Shadows. Now let's move on to talk about your rotation and abilities. As always, going over your normal one, then go over openers and CDs. The main idea with Subtlety is quite simple, to perform as many finishing moves as possible, so spending combo points. That's what your mastery improves, that's why you have passives like Shadow Techniques, granting a chance on auto attacks to apply a combo point and give 8 energy, and Relentless Strikes, which refunds part of your energy with every set finishing move. A Shadow Dance will also be a core component on the spec in order to build points, also having the Dampening Shadows passive, making each finishing move reduce its own cooldown by 1.5 seconds per combo point spent. So as you can see, all surrounding these two components. But before Shadow Dance, let's talk about the absolute basics. Stealth in sub is a crucial part of the spec due to the Shadowstrike ability, a more powerful backstab basically, that grants 2 points instead of 1, and obviously deals more damage. So it's highly recommended for you to organize your bars both in stealth and outside of stealth. Placing Shadowstrike in place of a backstab will be a good starting point. Another basic idea with Subtlety is your Nightblade ability. It's a dot that also increases your damage done to the target by 15%. So it's one of your main priorities to keep up at all times, since it costs points, let's just build some with both Shadowstrike and backstabs. Nightblade damage itself is secondary. What's important is that damage debuff that it provides. So the combo points accounts you want to use it with is not very important either. What's important is keeping it up. So using it between 3 to 5 points is acceptable, or 6 if you with deeper stratagem. Refreshing will also depend on your current combo points, as each point not only increases its damage but also its uptime. So it does benefit from the pandemic effect, but for the sake of simplicity, refreshing anytime below 6 seconds will be enough. Once it's set up, you want to build towards your most important finisher and damaging ability, Eviscerate. So once again, you go back to building combo points. When building points, be with backstab or shadow strikes, you want to keep in mind to not overcap them, but also take in mind you can generate set points passively due to shadow techniques. So using Eviscerate between 4 to 5 points will be enough, or 5 to 6 if with deeper stratagem. Energy is also something to keep in mind to not let overcap, but more on that in a bit when we get to other abilities. So this is the gist of sub. Build points and dump them, whilst keeping Nightblade active with some point management so you don't overcap them. Now obviously this isn't really optimal with just backstabs. Shadow Strikes is where it's at when it comes to point generation. Now Shadow Dance uses can be a little bit daunting at first. When should you use them? Do you use all charges outright? How does all of that work? This will make more sense when we get to opener, but let's get the idea of the ability first. As the tooltip states, Shadow Dance mimics stealth, giving access to its abilities. Mainly for Shadow Strikes, generate points quicker. Not only that, you're gonna get energy due to Master of Shadow's talent, making that easier, and extra damage if with Dark Shadow. So rules of Shadow Dances are always to keep the cooldown ticking, to maximize its uses. So no matter what, if you add 2 charges, you want to use it, or at 3 charges if with Enveloping Shadows. The other is to start with the lowest amount of combo points possible, and high on energy. Not at cap, but high on it. This isn't always possible, but aim for it, okay? And the other is to use with Symbols of Death. These abilities always go hand in hand with each other. And like I said, this will make more sense after openers, but Symbols of Death grants energy and increases your damage done by 15%, plus is out of the global cooldown. So in this example, after setting up a Nightblade and you low on combo points, you would go Shadow Dance and Shadow Strike immediately. There's a macro for this if you so wish to make it go faster or rather instantly, so check down below in the description, then Symbols of Death. They go hand in hand, but remember the energy Symbols gives. It's acceptable to overcap if you cannot avoid it, such as openers. It's best to use it anyway, even if it overcaps a bit of energy, to not use it at all, but do try to avoid that when possible. The idea here is to boost this Eviscerate that you're gonna do. So after that Symbols of Death, you go for another Shadow Strike and then Eviscerate. And then for the remainder of the Shadow Dance, do more Shadow Strikes and then another Eviscerate. As you can see, Shadow Dance is just allowing you to go for finishers much quicker, or rather build points much more efficiently, and to get that Find Weakness debuff on the target, which is also very important. If with Dark Shadow and Symbols of Death, you're gonna make those Eviscerates even bigger damage-wise. Once you have these ideas in mind, it's no longer that complicated or daunting. Just a bit of management, keeping track of that Nightblade timer, aiming Shadow Dances for either Symbols of Death or when about to top charges to build points faster for finishers, and remembering that Shadow Dance CD is reduced with said finishing moves, and that's it. If you with Secret Technique, obviously you're gonna use it in place of an Eviscerate always when available, that symbol. With Marked for Death, it will aid your point generation as well, giving you all 5. General use of it is used on cooldown outside of Shadow Dance, okay? Remember its cooldown is reset on targets that die with the debuff, so prioritize that if there is ads. Now onto your opener, to put this all in perspective. So when starting up any fight, you want to be in stealth at all times, giving you access to the much needed Shadow Strike, not only for combo points, but for the Find Weakness as well. If you with Marked for Death, you also want to use this as early as possible, even before the pull timer, if there is any. This will ensure you will get some points to start with. It won't be 5 by the time you will actually enter the fight, but it will make it so that the city starts rolling earlier, maximizing its uses. If you with deeper stratagem, don't worry about any of this. Either way, as you enter the fight, you want to pop Shadow Blades. It's your main big city, making all of your combo generators grant 1 extra point, plus extra damage as shadow damage. So during its window, your management will change slightly. You have to take in mind Shadowstrike is going to give 3 points and Backstab 2, plus the Shadow Technique's passive. Needless to say, a lot of finishers can be performed during your city windows. As you actually enter the fight, as you actually start fighting, all of this is kinda the before. You want to start with that Shadow Strike, no matter the point you have coming over from a marked for death to get that find weakness. Quickly after, you go for your Nightblade to set up that damage debuff. Remember to always set this up before going for your Shadow Dances. So now that you are empty, you go back to the previous rules or priority list from before using that Shadow Dance and Symbols of Death. You're gonna overcap energy here with that Symbols of Death, but like I said previously, that's fine. In your opener, you're just looking for that damage increase. So you go for 2 Shadow Strikes and an Eviscerate, and another 2 Shadow Strikes and another Eviscerate. So repeating that Shadow Dance rotation from before. Once again, if with Shadow Technique, use it instead. All of these buffs are just setting up for fat and quick Eviscerates, which is what you want here on sub. Once you finish that second Eviscerate, you spend your other Shadow Dance charge and repeat the same process. Now this is with Dark Shadow. If with Enveloping Shadows you do the same, but you will save that extra third charge of Shadow Dance for later. After this, you'll keep with a normal rotation. However, Vanish can be used as a mini Shadow Dance, giving you access to a single Shadow Strike and in turn refreshing Find Weakness. So when it's about to drop, use it also on cooldown. After, like I said, keep with a normal rotation, using our next Shadow Dance with every Symbols of Death, using any extra charge either when nearing the cap or during the Shadow Blades city window like here in your opener due to that 50% shadow damage increase, or rather as extra, or if the fight is about to end and you have no Symbols of Death available. Remember, you don't want to finish a fight with Shadow Dance charges, so empty them all even without the symbols. Marked for death again on cooldown outside of Shadow Dance, either for a quick Eviscerate or to refresh Nightblade. When it comes to traits, not many changes gameplay wise. However, in 8.1 the first dance trait will change to grant you 2 points when you pop Shadow Dance. What this will mean is that you can only use 1 Shadow Strike before a finishing move when using that Shadow Dance rotation, so look out for that if you're using the said trait. And that's it really. Now on to AoE. An AoE, or better known as the Mythic Zulkiller, is actually rather fun. I much prefer doing this over the single target rotation, because your rotation mostly stays the same except Shadow Dance uses and your combo builders. Simple rules to follow. On 2 targets, you're gonna replace the Backstab to Shuriken Storm. Shuriken Storm generates 1 point per target hit, so if with 2 targets you're gonna get an extra point per global cooldown over Backstab. However, during Shadow Dance, Shadow Strikes takes over that Shuriken Storms, since they generate the same amount of combo points per target and they will do more damage, so that will shift to Shuriken Storm, only to be usable at 3 targets while doing the said Shadow Dance. However, if you with Find Weakness, you still want to use at least 1 Shadow Strike per Shadow Dance window for that nice debuff. Now putting that aside, your idea here is not about damaging multiple targets per se, but more to use those same targets to fuel your single target damage. So you still pretty much only want to focus 1 target at a time. This will be the target you're gonna apply Nightblade and the Find Weakness debuffs. You don't want to multi-dot Nightblades. After, you're just gonna do those Shuriken Storms to build points quickly for Eviscerates or secret techniques, and that's it. Now Shadow Dance and Symbols of Death still go hand in hand, and you still want to use them in the same way, although here you want to try and enter its window high on combo points due to Dark Shadow and the nature of AoE in sub. So use it at 5 or 6 points, then go straight for an Eviscerate, followed by Shadow Strike or Shuriken Storm, depending on the situation stated above, and another Eviscerate when high on points. More targets here means faster and more finishing moves, and less Shuriken Storms needed. Shadow Dance does improve the Shuriken Storm damage, by the way. If you with Shuriken Tornado, the idea follows, except you're gonna get them passively, or rather they're gonna cast passively. So you're gonna have to time in your finishing moves in between those automatic Shuriken Storms. But that's it really. Quite different from other classes AoE, but actually quite fun. As for stats and traits to then wrap up. So agility here, like most specs, are usually king. However, crit and haste tends to be your best secondary stats in single target. Haste just speeds things up, allowing you to fit more abilities during Shadow Dance windows, increasing energy regeneration and etc. Crit does what it does, helping bringing out those big of its rates, with Mastery and Verse being slightly weaker. However, for AoE, Mastery values a lot more due to the high combo point generation that you have with the Shuriken Storms and the sheer amount of finishing moves you can do, making haste far less desirable. So having a gear stat for both situations will be a good idea here for sub if you want to perform your best. In terms of traits, I did mention the one that changed gameplay the most, but you can see there the most powerful ones, and in the description I provide a website where you can check all of the trait powers as it changed quite frequently, and more might be added in the future, and you can compare if it's best to have a regular trait or an old year trait, for an example. Blade and Shadows and Inevitability interact with your main abilities, but they just happen really, nothing to concern yourself about. And yeah, that covers it all. As always, thank you for watching, hope it helps. Remember to like and subscribe to get more videos like this, and check out my Patreon if you wish to support the channel. Have a fantastic day everyone, and I'll see you all next time. See ya!